The bass from the jukebox rattled the bar's worn floorboards, mixing with bursts of laughter and the scrape of bar stools against wood. It was a Friday night in a town where everyone seemed to know one another, where outsiders always drew eyes the moment they walked in. Two women slipped into the corner booth, identical in every way except the shade of lipstick one wore brighter than the other. Danielle and Dominique Carter, sisters born minutes apart, leaned back in their seats with the quiet exhaustion of people who had worked too many late nights, too many long cases, and still carried themselves with a confidence that drew whispers. They weren't there to be noticed, just toasting a small victory between them, one that nobody else in the room would ever know or care about. The bar smelled of beer and fried food, the kind of place that clung to your clothes long after you left. The locals were loud, voices overlapping, but beneath it all was the constant awareness. These sisters weren't from here. A man at the dartboard gave them a lingering glance, nudged his friend, then laughed at something that had nothing to do with the darts. Another at the pool table muttered under his breath, his eyes cutting their way again and again. It wasn't friendly curiosity. It was the kind of attention that turns celebration into caution. Dominique adjusted her glass on the table, her nails tapping against the rim in a rhythm only Danielle would recognize. A subtle signal, the kind of language twins carry from childhood. They didn't need to say it aloud. Something's off in here. Across the room, three men in rumpled shirts crowded the bar. Off duty, but their badges still glinted faintly from belts that should have been left at home. Their laughter was too loud, their shoulders too loose with drink. Every gesture carried the arrogance of men who knew no one in this town would dare tell them no. Danielle caught the way the bartender stiffened when they raised their glasses for another round. She didn't miss the way his eyes darted to the sisters' booth, then quickly away again. Stay invisible, Danielle thought. Just one drink, then out the door. That was the plan. But plans don't mean much when arrogance decides to test its reach. If you're here listening now, make sure you like and subscribe so you never miss stories like this one. And drop your country in the comments. I'd love to know where you're watching from. Dominique laughed softly at something Danielle said, but her eyes weren't on her sister. They were fixed on the trio at the bar, watching the way one of them leaned back too far on his stool, arms spread wide, scanning the room like it belonged to him. His gaze stopped at their booth. A grin spread across his face. He said something to the man beside him, and all three turned to look. Not casual, not friendly, like hunters choosing which deer to track through the woods. The sisters exchanged another glance, short, sharp, wordless. They'd seen looks like that before. In interrogation rooms, in alleys, but never in a place where they came only to rest. The jukebox clicked, switching songs. The laughter of the crowd dipped, then rose again. But in that half-second of quiet, the scrape of three stools pushing back cut through everything. Heavy boots crossed the floor. Danielle's shoulders squared. Dominique's fingers tightened around her glass. Every sound in the bar seemed to fade except for the footsteps drawing closer. And then a voice, rough with whiskey, leaned into their corner. Well, what do we have here? The night had just shifted, and neither sister knew yet how far these men were willing to go. The voice that broke through the hum of the bar carried authority, even in its drunken slur. Three men stood at the sisters' table, blocking the light. Sergeant Rick Dalton led the way. Heavy-set, flushed cheeks, jaw set like a man who believed every space was his to command. Beside him loomed Officer Mark Stevens, broad-shouldered and smirking, his shirt straining at the buttons. And trailing behind was Officer Kyle Boyd, younger, restless, his eyes darting like he was eager to prove something. Their badges glimmered faintly at their belts, not needed but still displayed, reminders of who held power in this town. Rick leaned his hand on the table, the smell of whiskey rolling from his breath. "Didn't think we had models in town tonight," he said, his grin thin and crooked. "Guess we got lucky." Mark chuckled, his gaze moving down and back up Dominique like he was assessing property. "Look at that hair," he said, reaching as if to touch before Danielle's glare froze him mid-motion. "Bet it takes a whole team to keep it tamed." Kyle swayed slightly, mimicking an exaggerated hip roll. "Attitude too. You can see it all over their faces. Don't smile, don't blend in, just walk in here acting like they're above everyone else. The words weren't said with heat. They were dropped like darts, casual, deliberate, meant to sting while leaving enough deniability if challenged. Laughter from the men followed, but it wasn't shared by anyone else. At the bar, Luis polished a glass so hard his knuckles whitened. A woman by the jukebox gathered her purse and left quickly. No one stepped in, no one spoke up. Dominique set her glass down, steady and slow. "Is there something you need, Sergeant?" Rick grinned wider, leaning closer until his bulk cast a shadow across both sisters. "Need? Just being neighborly. Folks like you should be grateful for attention." Danielle's jaw tightened. "Folks like us?" Rick tilted his head. "You know, not many around here with your complexion. You stand out." Mark laughed, slapping Kyle's shoulder. "I like how he put that. Complexion. Real polite way of saying they bring color to the room." Kyle smirked, his words slipping with a drunken slur. "Double the color, since you're twins. That's a rare treat." The sisters stayed silent, their calm only agitating the men further. Rick's smile thinned into something sharper. "See, that right there? That quiet. That's the attitude. Like you're too good to laugh, too good to share a drink with the boys who keep this town safe." Dominique's eyes flicked toward Luis again, but he only pressed his lips into a line, trapped behind the counter. Patrons shifted on their stools, staring hard into their drinks, pretending the confrontation wasn't happening. And in that moment, it became clear. Silence had chosen sides. The laughter of the three officers filled the space where intervention should have been. Mockery disguised as friendliness, authority disguised as banter. They wore their uniforms in their tone, even if their shirts were untucked, even if the bar stank of alcohol. Danielle's voice cut through the noise, low but firm. "We're not here to entertain you. Step back." Mark chuckled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Spicy one, huh? Bet she talks like that at home too. No wonder they don't know their place." Kyle leaned forward, whispering loud enough for the booth behind them to hear. "Bet you both get that sass from the same gene pool. Mama must have had her hands full with two of you." The words hung heavy in the air. Danielle's nails pressed into her palm under the table, Dominique's eyes hardening with each second. Rick straightened, towering above them, his tone shifting from mocking to commanding. "Don't like jokes? Maybe you don't like cops either. Careful how you answer, because in this town that can be a problem." Silence can be the loudest form of complicity. Every patron who looked away, every friend who whispered instead of speaking out, handed those men more power. Power to harass, power to humiliate, power to decide who deserved respect and who didn't. The jukebox played on, cheerful notes that felt wrong against the scene unfolding. The bar was still full, yet the sisters sat alone, hemmed in by three men who believed no one would stop them. And they weren't wrong. Not yet. Rick pulled out a chair with a scrape that made the nearest table flinch. He sat backward on it, leaning in until his elbows rested on the sisters' table. His smirk widened. "Now, let's see just how much attitude you really got." Rick didn't wait for permission. He spun the chair around and straddled it backward, half leaning in until his face was only inches from Danielle's. His grin never wavered, though his eyes sharpened with a cruel edge. "You know what I don't like?" he said, his breath thick with whiskey. "When people think they're in charge, you got that look about you, sweetheart. Like you're running the room. That don't sit well with me." Danielle sat straighter, her shoulders squared, her eyes locked on his without a blink. She didn't move, didn't flinch. That only seemed to egg him on. Mark shifted behind Dominique, dragging her chair closer to the table with a jerk that rattled her glass. His hands landed heavy on the backrest, one thumb brushing along the curve of her shoulder. He pressed down just enough to show he could pin her there if he wanted. "Soft skin," he muttered, his voice carrying just enough for the table behind them to hear. "Bet it feels real different than it looks." Dominique stiffened, but her face remained composed. She had been trained for worse situations, but training never dulled the heat of being cornered like prey. Kyle snorted, swaying on his feet, his words slurred into something mocking. "Twins. Double the trouble, huh? You two must get all kinds of attention. Bet you love it. That's why you're dressed like that. Don't pretend otherwise." He laughed at his own remark, swaying closer until his knees brushed the edge of the booth. His eyes flicked between them like he was choosing which one to taunt next. Around them, conversations hushed. Patrons weren't deaf, they heard every word. But glasses stayed lifted, eyes fixed on tables, on drinks, on anything but the sisters' corner. No one spoke, no one moved. Luis, the bartender, set down the glass he'd been polishing and walked toward the table, tray in hand like an excuse. His voice was tight, his hands trembling despite his attempt at calm. "Gentlemen, maybe it's time you give the ladies some space." Rick's head snapped around, his smile curdling into something darker. "Space? You think you run this place, Luis? Or do I need to make a call and have your kitchen inspected? You want immigration crawling through your back room again?" Luis froze, his face draining of color. He opened his mouth, then shut it quickly. His knuckles whitened around the tray. He knew exactly what that threat meant. One word out of line, and he'd lose not just his business, but everything. Rick turned back to Danielle, satisfied, his teeth flashing in a humorless grin. "See, that's respect. That's knowing when to shut up. You should learn from him." Danielle's gaze didn't flicker, her voice low, steady. "Take your hands off my sister." Mark leaned closer, his lips nearly brushing Dominique's ear. "Or what? You gonna call the cops? We are the cops." Kyle cackled, slapping his thigh like it was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. "That's rich. Who you think they'll believe? Us or you?" Dominique's glass sat untouched before her. She tightened her grip on the stem, but her voice stayed even. "Touch me again, and you'll regret it." Mark smirked, his fingers tightening just enough on her shoulders to make her wince. "Oh, I like it when they talk back. Makes it more fun." Rick's smirk widened. He leaned in even closer to Danielle, his shadow blocking her view of the rest of the room. "Let me spell it out. You and your sister are here because we let you be here. This is our town, our rules. The sooner you learn that, the smoother your night goes." Silence stretched across the room again, thick and suffocating. Every eye that wasn't on them pretended not to see. Every set of shoulders stayed hunched, every phone tucked away. Nobody dared step forward. Humiliation doesn't always come in fists or cuffs. Sometimes it comes in the way a room lets you be cornered, in the silence of strangers who know it's wrong but refuse to risk the cost of speaking up. That silence hands the oppressor more power than the badge ever could. Kyle leaned his elbows on the table, nearly knocking over Danielle's drink. "Tell you what," he slurred. "Why don't you smile for us? Just a little. Show some gratitude. Might make us forget your attitude." Neither sister moved, neither smiled. The tension drew tighter, like the bar itself was holding its breath. Rick finally leaned back, his grin stretching too wide, his voice dropping low. "Last chance. Play nice, or this night gets a whole lot worse." And with that, the trap was set, and the sisters knew they couldn't wait much longer before striking back. The pressure around the sisters' table had reached its peak. Mark's grip on Dominique's shoulders was no longer playful. It was possession. Rick leaned so far into Danielle's space she could smell the mix of whiskey and sweat on his collar. Kyle rocked on his heels, restless, itching to prove himself. Then, in one sharp movement, the boundary was shattered. Mark's hand cracked against Dominique's backside, the sound loud enough to snap the attention of everyone still pretending not to notice. Laughter followed, harsh and triumphant. Dominique shot up from her chair, her jaw tight, her face burning with fury and humiliation. "You son of..." She didn't finish. Rick surged forward, shoving Danielle back against the wall before she could rise to her sister's defense. His forearm pressed across her collarbone, pinning her there, his body weight crushing the air from her lungs. The bar went deathly quiet. The jukebox played on, a jarring contrast to the violence unfolding at center stage. Kyle grinned, pulling the handcuffs from his belt. He dangled them like a prize. "Now that's disorderly conduct. Threatening an officer? Guess it's time to teach you girls some respect." Danielle struggled against Rick's weight, her voice strained but firm. "Let go of me." Rick leaned closer, his lips nearly brushing her ear. "You don't give orders here. This is my town, my rules. And rule number 1, you don't disrespect the badge." Dominique shoved Mark's hand away, but he only laughed, stepping in close to block her path. "Careful, sweetheart. Resisting arrest could add a few more charges to your night." Phones began to slip discreetly out of pockets. A man in the corner angled his camera, his hands shaking. Another woman at the bar held her phone low, the red light of recording blinking faintly. Kyle spotted it first. His grin disappeared. He stormed across the room, snatching the device from the woman's hand. "No cameras," he barked, throwing the phone to the ground. The screen shattered, pieces skittering across the hardwood. The woman shrank back in her seat, eyes wide, hands trembling in her lap. Rick smirked, glancing around the room. Anyone else think they're brave enough to record police business? Didn't think so. The crowd shrank deeper into silence. Some sipped their drinks too quickly. Others stared down at the sticky floor. The message was clear. No one was going to help. Mark's hand trailed up Dominique's arm, his fingers digging into her skin. You know what your problem is? He sneered. No respect for authority, but don't worry, we'll fix that. Danielle turned her face against the rough wooden paneling, her voice muffled but steady. You're making the biggest mistake of your lives. Rick laughed, low and cruel. Mistake? No. You walked into our bar. You thought you could sit pretty and act like queens. But out here, you're nothing. Just another couple of outsiders who forgot their place. Dominique's eyes met her sister's across the table, a lifetime of silent communication sparking between them. Danielle's breathing was ragged under Rick's arm, but her gaze was sharp. One subtle tilt of her head, one shift of Dominique's hand, signals they had perfected since childhood, sharpened further by years of training. The sisters were cornered, but they weren't broken. Louise stepped forward again, voice tight with fear. Sergeant, that's enough. They've done nothing wrong. Rick snapped his head toward him, his eyes narrowing. You want me to shut this place down, Louise? Want me to call ICE and have them tear through your kitchen? One phone call. That's all it takes. Louise froze, his chest rising and falling fast. He looked like he wanted to scream, but no sound came. Instead, his hands balled into fists at his sides as he forced himself back behind the bar. Rick turned back to Danielle, pressing harder into her chest, his voice low and venomous. You see that? That's power. That's what it means to wear a badge. No one crosses us. Not him. Not you. Not anyone. Kyle swung the cuffs lazily in one hand, his grin returning. Come on, Sarge. Let's teach them some manners. Mark shoved Dominique back down into her chair, his hand gripping the backrest like iron. She sat, but her eyes stayed locked on Danielle. Silent words passed between them again. Wait, not yet. Injustice wears many faces. Sometimes it wears a uniform. Sometimes it wears silence. And sometimes, the most dangerous face of all is the one smiling while it strips away your dignity. The music played on, the crowd sat frozen, and the sisters held their ground. Rick leaned back slightly, his smirk dripping with contempt. You still think you're in charge? You're about to find out what happens when you cross the law in my town. The night had shifted past no return, and for the Carter sisters, the time for waiting was almost over. The clink of metal cut through the air like a verdict. Kyle snapped open the handcuffs, the sound sharp enough to draw every eye in the bar, even from those pretending not to look. He grabbed Dominique's wrist without warning, jerking her arm so hard she stumbled forward. Disorderly conduct, he slurred, forcing the cuff around her wrist. Threatening an officer, that's what you get. The steel bit into her skin, the edges digging deep. Dominique's breath caught, but her voice remained even. You're the ones causing disorder. Mark shoved her down further into the booth, pinning her with his weight as Kyle wrenched her other arm back. The second cuff snapped shut with deliberate force, so tight she winced. Her shoulders burned from the unnatural angle. Rick turned his attention back to Danielle, who still stood against the wall where he had pinned her. His forearm pressed across her chest like she was nothing more than an obstacle to push aside. And you, he said, his voice dropping low, resisting arrest. That'll look good on the paperwork. Danielle's jaw tightened. I haven't resisted anything. Rick leaned harder, smirking. You didn't submit. That's the same thing. Around them, the room had gone almost silent. Conversations had died. Glasses sat half-lifted, abandoned. The only sounds were the cuffs clinking against Dominique's wrists, Rick's heavy breathing, and the jukebox singing cheerfully in the background like a cruel joke. At a nearby table, a man whispered to his companion. They didn't do anything. Shh, the other hissed, eyes darting to the officers. Keep your head down. The sisters caught every word. The whispers were louder than shouts, proof that everyone saw but no one would move. Dominique's knees hit the sticky floor as Kyle shoved her down to make the cuffs tighter. Her palms burned from the impact. Mark chuckled, towering above her like it was a game. Not so high and mighty now, huh? Danielle twisted under Rick's grip, not fighting but refusing to bow her head. You're humiliating yourselves. Rick's lips brushed close to her ear as he muttered, No, sweetheart. We're showing everyone who's in charge. Luis appeared again at the edge of the scene, his tray clutched like a shield. His voice was strained, but steady. Sergeant, please, let them go. They haven't broken a single law. Rick's head snapped around, eyes narrowing into slits. Say one more word, and I'll have this whole place shut down before the sun comes up. You want that, Luis? You want me crawling through your back room with a health inspector? Luis froze. He swallowed hard, his fists trembling at his sides. His silence was louder than his plea. He turned back to the bar, shoulders heavy, knowing the trap had already closed. People weigh their jobs, their safety, their families before they weigh what's right. They weigh survival against justice, and most choose survival. That's how silence protects abuse. That's how racism flourishes. Not only in the mouths of aggressors, but in the silence of witnesses. The sisters locked eyes again, a wordless exchange carried on the current of their bond. Pain radiated through Dominique's shoulders, but her chin lifted. Danielle's chest strained against Rick's arm, but her eyes burned with defiance. Across the room, another phone lifted just above a glass, recording in secret. The woman holding it looked terrified, but her finger stayed on the screen. Hope flickered for a second. Proof was being gathered. Kyle noticed. His drunken grin returned as he stomped across the room, ripped the phone from her hand, and slammed it face down on the floor until the screen cracked. No recording, no evidence. You want to end up in cuffs too? He barked. The woman shrank back, tears welling in her eyes. Nobody spoke for her. Nobody dared. Rick pushed Danielle harder against the wall, his voice rising enough for the room to hear. This is what happens when you forget where you are. You don't walk in here with your pretty skin and your sharp tongues and think you run things. You answer to us. The weight of his words wasn't just aimed at the sisters. It was a performance for the whole bar, a reminder of the hierarchy he believed could never be challenged. Dominique straightened despite the cuffs, blood rushing to her hands. You think these people respect you? She said, her voice cold. They're just afraid of you. Rick's grin faltered for the briefest second. Then he leaned closer, his whisper dripping with venom. Afraid is good enough. The crowd sat frozen, watching, weighing their fear against their conscience. And once again, silence won. The cuffs dug into Dominique's wrists, the sharp edges biting deeper with every move. Pain radiated through her shoulders, but her mind raced faster than her body could falter. She glanced at Danielle, still pinned against the wall under Rick's weight. Their eyes locked, and in that silent exchange, a decision was made. Dominique twisted her wrists just enough to slip her fingers toward her back pocket. The motion was small, deliberate, masked by the way Kyle shoved her forward. Years of training had taught her to make the smallest action count. Her fingers brushed leather, her badge case. She let it slip free. The case fell to the floor with a heavy thud that silenced the laughter around them. It landed face up, the gold emblem gleaming in the dim light. The letters were unmistakable. Federal Bureau of Investigation. For a heartbeat, the bar was frozen. Every eye that had once avoided the sisters was now locked on the badge glinting under the bar's lamps. The room's silence cracked into a ripple, phones lifted again, screens glowing, people whispering in disbelief. Dominique's voice rang out, steady despite the cuffs. You're assaulting federal agents. Rick's body went rigid. His eyes flicked down at the badge, then up at Danielle. For the first time that night, uncertainty clouded his expression. His smirk faltered, if only for a second. Danielle seized the moment, her voice sharp and unshaken. Take your hands off me. Now. Mark scoffed, though his grip on Dominique's shoulders loosened slightly. You think a piece of metal changes what's happening here? Not in this town. Kyle laughed nervously, his voice cracking. Yeah, nice toy. Bet it's fake. But the doubt had already crept into their eyes. Phones continued to record openly now, held high, no longer hidden. Witnesses who had been silent suddenly found courage in the emblem shining from the floor. Rick bent down and kicked the case across the boards with the tip of his boot, as though dismissing it. But the panic that flickered in his bloodshot eyes betrayed him. You think the Bureau means anything here? He spat. This is our jurisdiction, our rules. Your badge doesn't buy you immunity from respect. Danielle's chin lifted, her voice louder now, carrying over the entire room. No, Sergeant. But it does mean you've just committed a federal crime in front of witnesses. A low murmur swept through the crowd. For the first time, someone at a nearby table muttered, They're FBI? His friend nodded, eyes wide, phone still recording. Luis stood frozen behind the bar, relief flashing across his features. He clutched the edge of the counter, his chest rising and falling as though he might finally breathe again. Rick's jaw tightened, his face flushing darker. He straightened, trying to reassert dominance. "Listen up," he barked, scanning the room. "No one here saw anything different than what I say happened. You understand? You're all witnesses to my report, not theirs." But his words rang hollow. The badge on the floor told another story, one too powerful to bury. Kyle swallowed hard, shifting uneasily. He looked at Rick, waiting for a cue. Mark, too, hesitated, his bravado slipping as Dominique's calm stare never broke. "You think you're untouchable," Rick growled, but there was less conviction now. "FBI or not, you're still outsiders. You came here thinking you were above us, but tonight you answered to me." Dominique stood, the cuffs rattling as she rose to her feet. The crowd gasped at her composure, at the way she straightened her back despite the bruises and restraints. Her voice cut cleanly through the bar. "No, Sergeant. Tonight you answer to the law you swore to uphold." The truth has a way of exposing rot. A badge doesn't erase prejudice, but it forces accountability where silence once reigned. And in that moment, the crowd's silence began to fracture, replaced by the courage of witnesses who could no longer pretend not to see. Phones recorded from every angle now. Some patrons whispered in shock, others held their cameras steady, determined to capture every word, every threat. The officers had gone from aggressors to defendants without realizing the ground beneath them had shifted. Rick's fists clenched. He scanned the room, saw the glow of a dozen screens raised against him, and for the first time that night, his smirk failed him completely. The Carter sisters had been underestimated, but now the whole bar knew exactly who they were. Federal agents, no longer just outsiders. And the men who thought themselves untouchable had just revealed their own undoing. The badge case skidded across the floor, its metallic clang echoing longer than it should have. Every patron's eyes followed the golden seal until it came to rest beneath a nearby stool. For a heartbeat, the silence held weight, like the entire room had frozen. Then Rick broke it with a sharp kick, sending the badge farther under the stool, as though burying what it represented. "Your card means nothing here," he sneered, his words loud enough for the whole bar. "You think that shiny emblem makes you untouchable? Not in my town, not on my watch." The laugh he forced out was brittle, hollow. But he kept it going, trying to mask the crack in his control. Kyle picked it up nervously, chuckling too loud, while Mark slapped the table to mimic agreement. Their voices rang false, desperate, but still intimidating enough to keep the bar frozen in place. Kyle bent down and yanked Dominique's arms higher behind her back, jerking the cuffs until they cut deeper into her skin. "See? FBI or not, you still bleed?" he muttered, his grin too wide, his voice shaky beneath the act. Dominique bit down against the pain, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a sound. Her shoulders burned, her wrists screamed, but her eyes stayed locked on Danielle. Danielle gave the slightest nod in return, a signal to hold, to endure. Rick pressed his arm harder into Danielle's chest, keeping her pinned to the wall. His face hovered inches from hers, spittle dotting his words. "You walk in here thinking you're better than us, smarter, stronger, but all I see is two women who don't know their place." Phones in the crowd trembled in raised hands. Some patrons angled themselves discreetly, while others leaned forward openly now, no longer pretending indifference. The officers' arrogance had shifted the room from quiet avoidance to open scrutiny. Luis, still frozen behind the bar, whispered through clenched teeth to a man seated near him. "Keep filming. Don't stop. They can't erase every camera in this place." Mark barked out a laugh, his grip still heavy on Dominique's shoulders. "Go ahead. Record all you want. You think anyone's gonna believe two women like you over three cops in uniform?" Danielle's voice cut through, steady, unflinching. "They'll believe the truth." Rick leaned closer, his smirk ugly. "Truth is what we write down, and right now, the truth says you resisted arrest." With a nod from him, Kyle wrenched Dominique's arms higher still. She staggered, gasping, her knees threatening to buckle. Mark steadied her with a mocking pat to the shoulder, as if helping her balance. The crowd winced collectively, a sharp intake of breath rippling across the room. Still, no one moved to intervene. Fear held them pinned to their seats. The officers weren't just drunk, they were trapped in their own arrogance. The badge on the floor hadn't humbled them, it had enraged them. Because to men like that, losing control in front of witnesses wasn't an option. Better to double down, better to twist the knife and prove their authority was still law, even when it was rotten to the core. Rick raised his voice, performing now for every phone in the room. Look at them. Disorderly, aggressive, threatening law enforcement, that's what's happening here, and every one of you is a witness. But his words only deepened the divide. Patrons shifted uneasily, muttering under their breath. The glow of cameras caught every detail. The bruises forming on Dominique's wrists, the sweat beading on Danielle's brow, the sneer stretched too thin on Rick's face. Danielle's voice rose above his. You're not writing the truth, you're proving it, and every person here can see it. The room felt ready to split between the power of the badge and the power of witnesses who no longer believed. Kyle yanked Dominique again, too rough, too desperate, and nearly toppled her forward. Mark steadied her with one arm, but looked up nervously, his confidence waning as murmurs grew louder in the room. Rick banged the wall with his fist, trying to reclaim control. Enough! One more word out of either of you, and I'll make sure you disappear into a cell so deep no one remembers your names. But even as he threatened, his eyes darted toward the glow of recording phones. And in that flicker of panic, everyone in the room saw what he already knew. The narrative was slipping beyond his grasp. The Carter sisters stayed silent, their bodies restrained, but their eyes spoke louder than any word. And for the first time all night, it wasn't just the sisters who knew the tide was about to turn. The entire bar could feel it. The arrogance that had ruled the room was beginning to crack. Luis's hands trembled as he slid his phone out from under the counter. He angled it just low enough to stay hidden, apron shielding the screen. With one quick swipe, he opened a live stream. The glow reflected faintly against the bottles behind him, but his movements stayed steady. His voice caught as he whispered under his breath, "Let the world see. Let someone see." The feed went live. Comments and notifications popped instantly. A handful of people scrolling late at night suddenly had front row seats to the bar, to the sight of 3 officers drunk and violent, and 2 women standing firm despite the humiliation. Across the room, phones already recording now lifted higher. A man near the pool table spoke louder than he meant to. "Keep filming, don't stop." Kyle spun, spotting him, but hesitated. The room was no longer hiding. Half the bar was capturing every move. His bravado cracked. Rick's teeth ground together as he barked over the growing murmur. "Turn those damn phones off, every last one of you." But no one obeyed. The silence that had once protected him was gone. In its place was the hum of dozens of cameras, glowing like eyes he could no longer blind. Then, from outside, headlights swept across the bar's windows. The crunch of tires on gravel. A new sound entered the chaos, the slam of a patrol car door. The crowd shifted, a ripple of relief breaking through. Help was coming, they thought. Order would be restored. Rick smirked, twisting Danielle harder against the wall as if to remind everyone of his grip. Good timing, reinforcements. The door creaked open. A lieutenant stepped in, younger than Rick but sober, his uniform neat, his gaze sharp. He froze at the sight before him. Dominique in cuffs, Danielle pinned, phones raised in every direction, and his fellow officers sweating under the scrutiny. "What the hell is going on here?" His voice rang clear, unclouded by alcohol. Rick didn't release Danielle. He didn't move an inch. Routine disturbance. Outsiders causing trouble. We're handling it. The lieutenant's eyes narrowed. His gaze dropped to the badge case under a stool. He bent, picked it up, and turned it over in his hand. The FBI emblem caught the light. Slowly, deliberately, he looked at the sisters, then back at Rick. "You cuffed federal agents?" The bar erupted in whispers. Phones angled closer. Every camera caught the exact moment Rick's face paled under the weight of recognition. Mark stepped back instinctively, his hands lifting off Dominique's shoulders. Kyle muttered under his breath, swaying where he stood. For the first time all night, the 3 men didn't look like predators. They looked like cornered prey. Danielle stepped forward, her voice cool despite the red mark across her collarbone. "Uncuff my sister, now." The lieutenant didn't hesitate. He snapped his gaze at Kyle. "Do it, immediately." Kyle fumbled with the key, his drunken fingers clumsy. The cuffs clattered to the floor as Dominique pulled her wrists free, red welts stark against her skin. She flexed her hands slowly, never taking her eyes off the men who had thought they could break her. Phones captured everything: the cuffs on the floor, the badge in the lieutenant's hand, the three officers stripped of their swagger. Rick tried one last time, his voice raised, desperate. "They came in here provoking us. You don't know how they were acting." "No," the lieutenant cut him off, his tone ice. "I know exactly how you were acting, and now so does everyone else." He gestured toward the glowing phones, the live stream still rolling in Luis's apron pocket. The bar wasn't silent anymore. People who had once looked away now spoke openly. "I saw it. They were cornered. They didn't do a damn thing." Witnesses emboldened each other, one voice turning into many, until the weight of truth was undeniable. Racism survives when it hides in shadows, when silence shields it. But once exposed, once dragged into the light, it begins to wither. And in that bar, with every phone raised, there was no darkness left for it to hide in. Rick's hand dropped from Danielle at last. His smirk was gone, replaced with something raw: fear, shame, rage. The dominance he had wielded so easily had collapsed in front of his own town. The Carter sisters didn't raise their voices. They didn't need to. Their very presence, steady and unbroken, was enough. They had endured. And now the men who tried to break them stood on trial before their community. For the first time all night, the bar belonged to them. The lieutenant's voice cut through the noise of the bar like a gavel striking wood. "Rick Dalton, Mark Stevens, Kyle Boyd, you're all under arrest." The room erupted. Phones rose higher, recording every second as the balance of power flipped in an instant. Rick's face reddened, his jaw clenched tight. Mark muttered under his breath, disbelief written across his features. Kyle swayed, panic setting in as the reality hit him. The lieutenant didn't give them time to argue. He signaled to the two patrol officers who had arrived behind him. They stepped forward with purpose, not hesitation, their hands firm on the shoulders of their drunken colleagues. "You can't do this," Rick barked, trying to wrench free. "You know who I am. You know what this will do to the department." The lieutenant's reply was calm, unwavering. "Exactly. That's why it has to be done." The clatter of cuffs echoed through the bar, sharp and final. This time, it wasn't the Carter sisters wearing them. It was the men who had humiliated them minutes earlier. Rick's curses, Mark's sputtered protests, and Kyle's slurred pleas rang hollow against the applause that began to ripple through the bar. Patrons who had been silent all night now found their voices. About time. They thought they were untouchable. Finally, someone's holding them accountable. Luis leaned against the bar, relief etched deep across his face. His stream was still running, comments flooding in from strangers miles away who had witnessed the scene unfold in real time. Within hours, the video spread across social media. By morning, national outlets were calling it the bar arrests. News vans lined the streets outside the sheriff's department. Reporters clamored for statements. The footage played on repeat, the smirk on Rick's face, the cuffs digging into Dominique's wrists, the FBI badge glinting under the bar lights. And the final reversal when the officers themselves were shackled and led out. The sheriff's department scrambled. Statements of internal review and temporary suspension fell flat against the evidence plastered across every screen. Civil rights groups called for deeper investigations. Community leaders demanded answers. And the Carter sisters, at the center of it all, stayed silent before cameras. Professional, composed. Their presence was enough. Behind closed doors, though, the weight lingered. Dominique rubbed the raw marks on her wrists, the red lines still visible days later. Danielle sat with her back straight, her breathing even, but her eyes carried a heaviness she couldn't shake. They had spent their careers believing in the badge, believing that, despite the cracks in the system, it could still mean protection. That night had stripped away another layer of that belief. Because the betrayal hadn't come from strangers. It had come from men sworn to the same oath. Power protects, but unchecked, it corrodes. And when it corrodes, it doesn't just taint those who wield it, it scars everyone it touches. That night, the Carter sisters carried themselves with the strength of professionals. But inside, they bore the fracture of knowing the badge could be turned into a weapon as easily as it could be a shield. The town that once looked away was forced to look closer. The cameras, the witnesses, the headlines, all of it ensured the story couldn't be buried. The officers who thought silence would shield them were exposed, their downfall immortalized on 1,000 screens. And though the sisters had endured, their victory was not a celebration. It was a reminder. Justice doesn't erase scars. It simply ensures the world sees who inflicted them. The bar never returned to normal. Even after the officers were dragged out in cuffs, even after the lieutenant's voice declared the charges aloud for all to hear, the air remained charged, heavy with the weight of what had just unfolded. Drinks sat untouched. Chairs stayed empty. Patrons whispered to one another, not about the music, not about the night's plans, but about the line they had just watched cross and snap. The Carter sisters did not celebrate. They did not demand applause. Danielle adjusted her collar, hiding the red mark pressed into her skin. Dominique flexed her wrists slowly, the burns from the cuffs still raw. They carried themselves as they had throughout the ordeal. Upright, composed, restrained. But anyone who looked closely could see it. The scars of betrayal that uniforms and badges cannot erase. They had walked into that bar as customers. They walked out as symbols, not because they wanted to be, but because they had no choice. They thought they were humiliating two women. They didn't realize they were exposing themselves to the whole world. The video spread further than the town could contain. People watched from living rooms and phones thousands of miles away. Some replayed it in outrage, others in shame, and some watched in recognition, seeing their own lived experiences reflected in the sisters' quiet endurance. Danielle and Dominique had held the line with more than training. They had done it with dignity, with patience, with restraint that spoke louder than fists ever could. They became proof that justice can be won without shouting, even in the face of humiliation. And yet, beneath the calm exterior, the truth lingered. Restraint carries a cost. On that night, it wasn't just the Carter sisters who stood trial. It was the silence of every witness, the arrogance of every badge, and the fragility of justice itself. Because justice that relies on silence breaking only after cameras roll is fragile. Because authority that demands fear rather than respect corrodes itself. And because a system that punishes truth-tellers before abusers must be held to account again and again. Danielle and Dominique walked out of the bar as agents, yes, but also as survivors of yet another test of what it means to exist in black skin, even while wearing a badge of their own. They didn't need to say it. Their story said it for them, and now it rests with us. The witnesses, the viewers, the ones hearing this story long after the cuffs clattered to the ground. What would you have done in Danielle and Dominique's place? Would you have stayed silent like the crowd that night, afraid of risk, afraid of consequence? Or would you have stood with them? Let us know in the comments, and don't just write your thoughts. Comment your country flag so we know where you're watching from. Because this isn't just a story about one bar, one town, or one night. It's a story about every place where silence is mistaken for safety. And before you go, like and subscribe to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ, because silence should never be the ending to any story.